Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Wesley Kinsey, and Paige Durham and I are instructional designers at Germanna Community College. We're excited to be able to present to you a conversation about universal design for learning. So I'm going to turn my video off so you don't see me waving my hands around, and we can focus just on what we're talking about tonight. So just so you know, we have a lot of information that we're going to cover in the next hour. In fact, this is 3 different sessions that we've kind of combined into one. Excuse me for the dogs in the background. So we have 3 different sessions that we've combined into one that we're going to try to walk you through some different parts of universal design for learning, walk you through the ideas of culturally responsive teaching, and then really dive into some nuts and bolts of accessibility and how this looks in your courses. If you do have any questions along the way, we'd love to answer them for you. We just ask that you use the Q&A section of the webinar because you won't be able to necessarily type it in the chat. So feel free to answer or ask any questions. We'll answer them either live or by typing in some text. And with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. To begin tonight, let's talk about what universal design is, talk about its background, how it might look in your courses, and why we use UDL in teaching and learning. And that last part is going to be one of the most important things that we talk about tonight. Why do we use this? So let's introduce it. Universal design for learning is kind of one of those buzzwords in education. It's something that lots of people talk about, but we want to know what it means. The first thing we want to know is that it's a field. It's a field that's devoted to solving problems and making resources easy and accessible to all learners. That's one of the main points of universal design, is that it's meant to solve problems. But it's also a map. It encompasses text and video, audio documents, web pages, web design, writing styles, and so much more. It's more than just an idea of how we promote accessibility, but it gives us all of the tools to be able to do that. So to drive this home about its importance just a little bit more, we want to point out that there are over 2 million students currently that have a disability on college campuses throughout the United States. So there's a need for universal design, especially for those students. But remember, that's only 2 million students that have registered with their Office of Accessibility or Disability Resources. So there are more students that are on our campuses today that have not registered that still need the benefit of this type of design. And to zoom in a little bit closer, just within the Virginia Community College system, we have a little over 6,000 students that are currently using resources for accessibility. But the number of students who need accessibility is much greater than this. So there's a great need for this conversation and for us to understand how this is working in our courses. It's kind of the same thing that we look at with accessibility in other parts of life. For example, how many of us use the ramps into buildings rather than the stairs? That could be because we may be pushing a stroller, or maybe we have an injury. And so we have other reasons for why we're actually using that ramp than what was intentionally designed for. The same is true for universal design in our courses. It's going to benefit every learner. So with that in mind, let's talk about where universal design comes from. First, it comes from neuroscience. It was developed out of the Center for Applied Special Teaching. They are the ones that kind of coined the phrase universal design for learning and built some frameworks around it. We also see universal design for learning really embraced and used in the K-12 environment. And it kind of started there. Higher ed was working through it, but K-12 really embraced it and took off with it. The reason for that, we think, is because universal design for learning requires change. And that's something that we may be slow to do in higher ed. We're slow to really adapt to those types of things. And so that's why we're having this conversation, because the time has come. So CAST, the Center for Applied Special Teaching, has an official definition of universal design. And they say that universal design engages the why, the what, and the how of learning. Well, what does that mean? That's talking about different ways that we interact in the course. So the hows are how learners demonstrate their understanding, their action and expression. And the universal design allows for multiple ways of expression. The why is multiple ways to be engaged, why they're in this learning environment. And the what are multiple ways of representing content in the course. And so that's one of the things that really matters when it comes to thinking about how we design our courses from a universal perspective. To look at it from a different way, they really backed this up with some neuroscience and talked about the why of learning comes from the affective network. It's that motivational piece, the thing that keeps students engaged and motivated and wanting to be there. The what of learning is the content. It's the recognition network. It's really the cognitive piece. And that's how we gather the facts and we categorize what we hear. We develop them into schemata in our brain, if we're going to use the big word, and we really make sense of that information. And then the how of learning is the strategic network. This is how we organize it and then turn around and express it, how we're demonstrating that we understand this information. So the goal of UDL is to create learners who control their learning. That's the idea. We're empowering these learners to control their learning. And the word learner there is intentional because from a UDL perspective, students are assessed by instructors. I mean, that's the idea. Instructors assess students. But we want learners because they assess themselves. And universal design for learning allows that to happen. And that's one of the main things that we want to see happen by implementing these strategies. So what are the components of UDL? How does this look like? What does this look like in our courses? Well, to begin with, what do you see in this image? Now, we could spend some time kind of talking about the image, and if our eyes are working properly and everything's good to go, and we're not too tired here on this evening, we could look and we could describe its trees, we could describe the scenery, we could describe the different colors. But what if I was a person who had some type of form of color blindness, where maybe I can't see the color green really well? This particular image then would look entirely different to myself. And it would actually look more in tones of gray than anything else. And so when you started asking me to describe this image, I wouldn't really know how to do that. I wouldn't know how to do that in a way that would be beneficial for you or for myself. And so universal design for learning allows us to take that into account when we're designing our courses. So the main thing that kind of goes with this concept is that we do what's called a +1. The idea is that whatever we're currently doing in our courses, we do one other way for our student to either engage, to represent, or to have an action or expression. So let's kind of take a deep dive onto those three components. The first thing is that we provide multiple means of engagement. And remember, this is the why of learning. This is that motivational piece. So we're providing multiple ways for students to be motivated and engaged in our courses. So this can include providing student choice, maybe ensuring that our course content is relevant to the course and subject, for showing our students the value of that content, removing the distractions from the learning environment, having a consistent navigation. Maybe it's including building a community within our courses or providing opportunities for reflection. These are all ways that we can build engagement into our courses. And if we're providing multiple means, then students from across the spectrum of learners will be able to engage in our course. With representation, we're talking about the what of learning, the content piece, and it's how we give information to our students and we represent this to them. And so that could include by just giving information and providing multiple alternatives for displaying auditory and visual information. Maybe it's taking our time with difficult vocabulary and clarifying that language and symbol and syntax for non-familiar students. Maybe it's illustrating these things by providing multiple examples of language or mathematical notations or symbols and doing that through multiple media. Maybe it's providing a lot of background knowledge, and maybe that's not something that we say in a lecture or say in a conversation, but we provide the resources for those students who need it. It's definitely guiding learning and helping our students see patterns and trends and critical ideas and features and the relationships in our content, because that's where they're starting to build that how network. And then transferring that information. Do we provide multiple means for them to transfer this to future problems or tasks and connecting it to past problems or tasks? Which leads directly into action and expression, the how of learning. Are we providing multiple means for students to show us they know and understand the content? That could be through some type of physical action where we're providing multiple methods of response and navigation. Maybe it's different tools or assistive technologies that we have available through our resources that we can provide for students. It's communication, providing multiple means of communication. It's support, it's strategy, it's monitoring. All of these things are things that we as instructors and designers can do to ensure that our courses are universally designed. They allow for all students to have an excellent educational experience within our courses. So why do we do this? Why are we even having this conversation tonight? What's the big deal? Well, the first thing is that UDL matters because it's a regulatory requirement. This is one of those things that's required by law for our courses to be accessible. It's especially true for our courses if we want to have federal funding for our students to take our courses and for government grants to infuse into our institutions. UDL matters because it makes sure that we are in compliance with all kinds of things outside of us. In fact, just a brief tangent on this, this is actually a growing concern where people are taking online courses from institutions and finding them not to be accessible and then beginning class action lawsuits against those institutions. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and ensuring that our courses are accessible for all learners, not just so that we don't get in trouble, but so that they actually have a good educational experience in our courses. And then business requirements. This goes back to those things that I was talking about earlier with ramps outside of buildings. It's just a good idea because it improves results for corporate learning programs. It benefits diverse learners and provides equal opportunities for all participants. And that's what universal design does. Some other things that it works on and that it does really well is that it minimizes the challenges caused by color blindness, a weaker vision, or a total vision loss. Understanding that our students who are accessing our courses through visual means, especially online courses, should be able to access those resources without a major disruption due to some type of vision loss. We make navigation easier for those with mobility challenges. We remove barriers that can be caused by accents or dialects by helping provide a universal experience. We resolve some level of issues from dyslexia by implementing UDL, and then we enable those with hearing loss to learn course content. So what UDL does is it takes our courses and provides an even playing field for all of our students, no matter their backgrounds. Now, what's really essential to this piece is that we couple universal design with culturally responsive teaching. And so I'm going to take a moment and let Paige talk about that.
Okay, so culturally responsive teaching and UDL, how do those two things tie together? So what we're going to go over is what is culturally responsive teaching, and then why we should use it, and tools to make our teaching culturally responsive, and some common misconceptions. So let's start with what is it? Culturally responsive teaching is its pedagogy. So it is recognizing the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. It's also a process. So it's focusing on the role of communication and receiving communication, shaping the thinking process of groups and individuals, and it celebrates the differences in cultural learning. Culturally responsive teaching is defined as using the cultural characteristics, experiences, and perspectives of ethnically diverse students as conduits for teaching them more effectively. So thinking about this, what does that mean? So here is an example that may help you understand it. So culturally responsive teaching leverages the brain's memory system. So we have many diverse students who come from oral cultural traditions. This means that their primary ways of knowledge transfer and making meaning are oral and active. It's a common cultural tradition that cuts across racial groups, African American, Latino, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, all have very strong oral cultures. Each of these cultural groups uses the brain's memory systems for turning inert information into usable knowledge. They use memory strategies to make learning sticky, like connecting what needs to be remembered to a rhythm or music. That is why we still know the ABC song, or by reciting it in fun ways like a poem, a riddle, or a limerick. So once you have an idea of what this is actually thinking about, this helps you to figure out, well, why should we be using this? So looking at cultures, culture means many different things. So it includes gender, language, country, religion, neighborhood, regional affiliation, age, socioeconomic background, ethnicity, racial identification, sexual orientation, and disability. It is a very, very large topic when we talk about culture. What are the cultural influences? So how students learn, which is the example that I just gave you about the oral traditions. Along with partnering with the oral traditions is an oral tradition. So they're getting their information orally, but they're receiving it orally. So we have to keep in mind those things when we're creating our content, and we need to remember that we need to offer it in many different ways. So what Wesley said was, when we're talking about using those things, we're thinking about that, adding that +1. So I might have a PDF of content, but I also want to try to find a video that covers that same content to help those students who need that in a different way in order to make that connection. So Zaretta Hammond has written a book. If you're not familiar with it, it is called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And this is a great quote from her book. The problem of the achievement gap will not be solved by simply trying to motivate students of color to become more engaged learners. We have to create school environments that welcome their natural ways of learning and shape the content so that they see its connection to their lives and funds of knowledge. So moving on and keeping on going to why I use it. So these 4 things help us to understand why we need to continually think about and learn and research and understand cultures other than our own. So we have to understand that those learners need to feel seen by their instructor. So they need to understand that you are willing to accept their culture and the way that they gain their knowledge and how it is expressed back to you. Those responses can be responding to name, and also noticing when a student does something different and giving them that affirmation that what they're doing is correct and and they are on the right path. And if it is different than their classmates, that difference doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it different. So again, we're back to the brain here, using cultural tools for processing information. Those cultural tools, again, can be video, can be music, can be poems. So we're thinking about adding things in that help make those connections for our students. And then when we are teaching, we want to try to mirror the same way that some of those students are learning. So for example, you could be creating a video each week that goes over the content of your weekly unit. And in that video, you're talking through all of the stuff, but you also are providing a written form of that in maybe a page in Canvas so that those students have that information in those many different ways. So some more about why this is important is because it creates a communalism. So it's understanding the worldview of interdependence. I am because we are. As Americans, we are very independent. However, there are many cultures who do everything as a group, and that is how their culture is done. So when we have students who want to do group projects or work together or have a collaboration with other students, that might be part of the way that they have always done things. And again, it doesn't make it wrong, and we need to figure out ways to incorporate those things into our own teaching so that we are giving those students the chance to bring in their way of learning and help them to gain the content knowledge that we are requesting and requiring of them. So we also have to understand that by reaching out to the students and providing them with these multiple opportunities to complete projects and multiple ways to interact with the content, we are building connections and trust. And what that does is that allows those students who may want to ask you a question or ask you for a different way of doing a project, or reach out and say, hey, you know, I would like to do a presentation on this, or a video or a cartoon rather than a paper. They have, and you've built that trust so that if they do reach out, that gives you the information that you need to say, hey, I need to reconsider how I asked for my assessment to be done. And are there other ways that an assessment that I can let students do that still covers what I need to cover and meets the objectives? So to become culturally responsive. So if you want to understand thinking about it, so you have to understand that culture has a role in education. You also have to understand that you're going to have to actively learn about your students' cultures and communities, whether that's in research, or it's talking to the students, or it's having small groups, and it's really picking up on very small things that students are telling you, and then you taking that small information and then going forward with it. So you're going to have to think about learning both about the beliefs, the way that they learn, what's in their culture, and then as always, you're going to be the lifelong learner and broadening your own awareness so that you can incorporate all of those things that your students need in order to be successful. So the Ready for Rigor is a tool. It is a framework, actually, that talks about awareness, learning partnerships, information processing, and community building. So culture means we explore our own cultural beliefs and biases and how the brain learns. Now, when we've done that, then we can reach into another culture and learn about those beliefs and biases and how that culture's brain learns. And as we're doing this, we're bringing all this together. The learning partnerships, again, so diverse learners will need to be in partnership with instructors and build trust. Again, it's that trust relationship that is a key piece of understanding the culture and letting students feel free to tell you or ask you or explain or give you ideas of how to change things that will help them learn. Information processing. So brain-based information processing strategies common to oral cultures. And tonight it's oral and oral are just tongue-tied for me. So thinking about those oral cultures. So I like to talk briefly about this story that I heard many years ago when I was at a music conference, and we were talking about the word music, and our presenter was from Ghana, and he stopped us and he said, wait, what word? And we said music, and he's like, we don't have a word for music in my language. Music is part of everything. It's part of every single activity. And unlike in our society, we have separated music from things. We have music for special occasions, but it's not in everything. So we have to understand that, and because of that, that music is part of everything. That is how a lot of information is passed along, both in stories, in history, and all kinds of celebrations and things like that. It is not separate. So imagine trying to have a group of students who have learned everything in song, and now you're asking them to just read it on paper. Community building. We want to make sure that our environment is friendly and emotionally and socially safe. So again, that goes back and that ties into the trust. We have to make sure that our learning environment is one where students feel free to speak their minds and know that they're in a safe place so that we can learn from them and they can learn. And all of our students can also learn in the process. So 3 tips to make any lesson culturally responsive. So you can gamify it. So most games employ lots of different things, lots of oral traditions, lots of repetition, puzzle solving, it's active. And then it also helps to make connections between things that don't seem related. If you think about using a breakout box, which requires the students to solve puzzles in order to learn information, and they have to do it as a group and it's collaborative, that's a great way to gamify. Make it social. Again, going back to the breakout box, that is a social thing. You cannot do a breakout box by yourself. Each person who's in the group brings a certain skill to the group and helps them solve those problems so that you can reach the end goal, which is to unlock all of the locks. So, and Storyfy. I like to consider myself a great storyteller, and I use stories a lot to really connect to students. A, it's an oral tradition, and B, obviously, I like to talk because I've been in teaching for forever. So again, and asking a student to also storyfy it. So you can ask them to create a story that helps them process what they've learned. And it also helps them to other people to see that story. And it might help us another student in learning all of the things that we're asking. Oh, sorry. Little cat problem. Other practices. So here are some instructional practices that you can use. So you can incorporate a reflection into a minute paper. So what is a minute paper? A minute paper is at the end of a unit, you say, okay, in a very short, you have 1 minute to write down exactly what you think you learned and what you feel you aren't really sure about. Doesn't have to really be a minute, but it's a very short paper. And then that way you can go back and review what you've done. And if there are things that are missing, it gives you the ability to revamp that unit before the next offering of the class. Again, supporting the students in writing assignments, if you give them very detailed instruction and a rubric with an example, and then allow the students to have a rough draft that could even be done by as a peer review, then you're using all of those things and tying it together so that that possibly isn't their best way of learning, but it gives them the opportunity to practice before they are assessed. So providing skeletal notes for lectures so that students can follow along. Some students have no idea how to take lecture notes. So giving them a rough idea of the topics that you're going to talk about and letting them fill in the information helps them as well. And then preview and summarizing information in teaching sessions so they can make connections. So having those pre-review Zoom sessions before any kind of quiz, or if you're in the classroom, a pre-review, or you can have a small group session and pop in and let the students ask you questions. Those are some ways that you can incorporate those things. Now, I saved misconceptions for last because I didn't want to start with the negative, and I wanted to start with a positive. And so the misconceptions are simply this: culturally responsive teaching is the same as multicultural or social justice education. No, it is not. Culturally responsive teaching must start with addressing implicit bias. No, it does not. Culturally responsive teaching is all about building relationships and self-esteem. And then the last one, culturally responsive teaching, is about choosing the right strategies. So multicultural education, according to Zaretta Hammond, is the celebration of diversity that we usually see in schools. Social justice education is about building a lens for the student really being able to look at the world and seeing where things are fair or where injustice exists. Culturally responsive teaching is about building the learning capacity of the individual student. So now in the next one, you're going to see a chart, and it's very small, and we're going to provide these to you on the EdTech website next week. So distinguish of equity are the three categories that I just talked about. So multicultural education, social justice education, and culturally responsive education. So thinking about multicultural education is celebrating diversity. That's the focus. Social justice education is focusing on exposing the social political content that student experience. And then culturally responsive education focuses on proving the learning capacity of diverse students who have been marginalized educationally. So if we're thinking back to the oral tradition, we're thinking about all of the things and all of the text heavy content that we have asked students to immerse themselves in and possibly have already hindered their learning because we did not give it to them in ways that met their needs. All right, I'm going to stop talking for a second and get a drink, and I'm going to let Wesley start with the nuts and bolts.
Thanks, Paige. So we know that we have just covered a ton of pedagogical information. And so this may take a couple of minutes to kind of process. Just as a reminder, if you have any questions, especially on this next part, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'd love to help clarify anything that we're talking about tonight, especially as now we transition into talking about what we do with all of this information. How do we make this work? So we're going to look at some general guidelines of accessibility in online courses, and then we're going to talk about structure, and then we're going to talk about two different tools that you can use to check the accessibility of your courses. Now, before we do this little deep dive, I want to remind you, we're talking about universal design for learning. We're not just talking about accessibility, but we can't take the two things and move them apart from each other. Accessibility is part of universal design, and universal design requires accessibility. So we have to talk about them, and we need to talk about them so that we can make sure that our courses are universally designed by being accessible. So let's talk about some general guidelines. Our general guidelines that we use as part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And you can see we're on 2.0 right now. I think they're working on 3.0 currently. But these are general guidelines that are used across industry spaces. So this isn't just an educational thing that somebody said, you know what we need to do? We need to do this. No, these are guidelines that are used across industries, and they encompass they take over a wide range of accessibility issues, even though they're not all encompassing. So they're not going to cover every single thing, but they're going to cover a lot of what we're talking about. So what are they? What do they mean? The first is that we want to make sure that our content that is on a web space is perceivable. So that's providing text alternatives for non-text content. That's that image alt tag, if you know what that means. If you don't, we're going to talk about it in a few minutes. It's providing alternatives for time-based media. So that includes having transcripts for recordings. That's creating content that can be presented in different ways, not just visually, but also auditorially or vice versa. And that we make sure that our content is easy for students or users to see and to hear. So that's including that high contrast color, that's including captioning and those kinds of things. We make sure our content is perceivable. We also make sure our content is operable, which means that we can operate whatever is on our website by making that functionality available from a keyboard. We provide users enough time to read and use content on the page. We're not rushing them through things. We don't design content in a way that's known to cause seizures. And we provide ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. We also want to make sure that our content is understandable, that it's readable and understandable by users. So it's not using a heavily jargon language, but it's also not using weird fonts or different types of formatting that makes it difficult. We want to make our web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. This goes back to that consistent course navigation. And we want to help our users avoid and correct mistakes. Now, we hear that as instructors and as people in education, and we're like, oh, well, we want them to correct their mistakes. But we're not talking about, that they put in the wrong answer. We're talking about they clicked on the wrong button and found themselves in the wrong start part of the website. And so how can we help them find that and correct it and make it better? We also want to make sure that our content, sorry, brain stopped for a second. We want to make sure that our content is robust, that it maximizes compatibility with current and future user agents, including assistive technologies. So we make sure that our course content or that our content on our website is useful and usable by assistive technologies like screen readers or other types of technology used by students with disabilities. Now, one thing to note about all of this, you may hear all of that and say, that's a whole lot to place on the foot of an instructor. And you're right, it is a lot. But Canvas has done a lot of this work for us. They use these guidelines in correcting the shell of Canvas. So the actual LMS pieces are WCAG compliant. And so that's nice. But we want to make sure that the content we put in also includes that as well. Now, we're going to transition here to talk a little bit about structure, because accessibility isn't just about some of those guidelines, but what does this actually look like inside of our courses? How do we structure our courses in a way that's accessible? So we're going to look at a couple of different things, from course navigation to accessible images, tables, hyperlinks, captioning, transcripts, document structures with headings, and searchable PDFs. So let's take a look and see what these things all mean. So the first thing we talk about is that course content should be consistent. That means, our course navigation should be consistent. That means it's logical. So we include a module structure by grouping things together by weeks or by units or by chapters. So we provide a logical structure to the course so that when students access our courses, they know where to go to find the information. We're not sending them all throughout the LMS to find things. We make sure that our course navigation is efficient. Our materials should be in one place for student access. That's another reason that we use modules. So they're not having to go to pages, discussions, assignments, quizzes to find the different things that they need. And heaven forbid, they're not going through grades to access their assignments, but they're actually directed to go to modules, and it becomes more efficient. We want to make sure that our course navigation is sequential, that our modules begin with introductions and overviews, and that each item in that module builds on itself, builds on the previous item, and that modules build on it, so that from the day the student begins the course and clicks start here or whatever it is to get them started, to the day that they take their final exam and they're done, everything should be building on it within the course. So we're not just talking about alignment of course content, we're talking about sequential movement through the course. And then we think about file names, that they should be consistent, that links should be descriptive, that icons should be used to identify assets, that we are including all of the pieces together so that students can see in the course what they need. So if we're uploading files, we're not just labeling our files a random series of letters or numbers. That may mean something to us, but it means nothing to the student. We're descriptive with our links and we're descriptive with our text. Here's some examples of what we're talking about with consistent course navigation. So here on the left, you'll see an example of the course navigation menu inside of Canvas and how it's simplified, it's direct, and it's efficient. So students don't have access to all of the other things that could distract them. Rather, they are focusing just on the things that they need: announcements, modules, the syllabus, grades, their services that are available. We want to make sure they have access to those things. And there on the right is an example of a sequential module. You'll see it starts with an overview, moves through content into activities, and ends with a summary. And each module is built with that in mind. And so as the students move through the course, they get more familiar with how these modules are built, and they get familiar with how they can navigate through the course. So it's consistent. We've already looked at this image before. What do we see when we look here? Well, we see an image that may not be accessible. And so we want to make sure that our images are accessible by adding alternative text. Alternative text is a descriptive text that tells the function and context of the image, or we just label that image as decorative. And so a screen reader will skip over that image and move right on about. So when we're thinking about adding alt text, we want to make sure that it's very simple and very short, because this is what's going to be read out loud to the user of an assistive technology like a screen reader. If it's a complex image that requires a longer description, we should link to a separate Canvas page that includes that description. We also want to make sure in developing those alt tags that we're looking around at the surrounding text and understanding how that image fits in with the other context and the other content that it's in. We don't want to use words that are not within that content. We want to make sure that we're reinforcing that vocabulary. And we don't want to add information that's already found in the surrounding text, because then the screen reader is just going to read it again. We only include color if it's going to add to the meaning and content of the image. So if it's necessary, if it's going to add to meaning. If the image requires a lengthy description, a really easy thing to do would be to caption it rather than the alt text it. And then in the alt text, you can just say, refer to the caption for more information. So that's one way you can make images accessible. And here's how you do it in Canvas. It's an attribute inside of Canvas that you can provide in alt text where you describe its image or mark it as decorative, and then you can update it. One other thing when we talk about images, we talk about color and contrast. Now remember, in those alt texts, we only use color if it addresses function or meaning, but when we're talking about color and contrast, we're talking about how things appear on a page. So we make sure that color is not our only way of conveying important information. Just because you mark a text in red doesn't make it important, especially to a student who has red-green color blindness. Rather, you should use things like bold or italics or underlining to make sure that we see the emphasis that's placed on that particular word. We want to provide high color contrast between text and its background. And I'll show you an example of this in a second, but we want to make sure that it's easily distinguishable when we're talking about where the text is and the background color. We want to avoid combinations like red and green, or colors that are rich in red and green hues, or black text on a red background. These are things that can be really inaccessible and accessible for students with particular vision blindness. Here's some examples. If you look on the left, you'll see a chart of that text color versus background color, and you'll see that we look for high contrast. Now notice that we look for things that are going to show up, that are going to be very visible, and they're not easily kind of indistinguishable from each other. On the right, you can see an image, and as it's processed through different filters that replicate what it looks like with different color blindness. So you can see on that image, and I think that looks like, tomatoes, basil, and mozzarella on a piece of bruschetta. So if we're talking about that, I'm not going to say, look at the red tomatoes if someone has some type of color blindness, because they're not going to know the difference between the red and the basil or the green basil and the red tomatoes. So we want to make sure that we're including information that's only relevant to the content. When we talk about tables, we want to make sure that our tables have rows and column headers, and that we associate those data cells with appropriate headers. So we're not just throwing a table out there and putting information in it, that we're ensuring that the content is accessible in that table. One of the biggest things that we want to talk about with tables is that we use proportional sizing, which is just as simple as making sure that we use percentages for width and height rather than using pixels. This will allow that table to shrink as the page shrinks and to enlarge as the page enlarges, rather than always having to scroll to the left and right when we resize the page. When we talk about hyperlinks, here's some things to think about. You don't want to use the word link in your links. You don't want to say click here or this link. That word needs to be descriptive. Whatever the link is needs to be descriptive for what the link is. We don't need to capitalize the links. We can see the link. We know it's a link. We want to avoid the ASC2 characters. So we want to make sure that we're just using standard English letters and numbers that are on the keyboard. We're not using symbols, and we're not using emojis for links. We want to avoid using URLs as link text. So it's really easy to just paste that Zoom link right there on your syllabus and move on. It's not very accessible. So instead, if we type Zoom link or Zoom meeting or something like that, office hour meeting, that would be a little bit more accessible so that students know that that's what that link does. We want to keep the link text concise. We don't want a link that goes all across the page. We want to restrict the number of text links on a page. We don't want just a page that links out to 15,000 things. It needs to be concise. And we don't want to link directly to downloads. So this is a big one in Canvas that I find all the time. When we embed files in Canvas, it embeds as a link. So instead of having students click that link to download the file, we should instead do the work to make that file automatically open for students when they click on the page. It's called Auto Inline Preview, and it embeds the file on the page. Students can view it and they don't have to click the link to download it. We always want to alert the user when opening new windows. And so when they click the link, we want it to let them know, that this is going to open a new window. Canvas does that for us automatically if you click the button that says load in a new tab. You want to be aware of pagination and alphabetized links, making sure that our links stay together on the page. We want to be mindful when using anchor links, and we want to underline our links. We don't want to use images as links. We want to eliminate broken and empty links. That's why we use the validate links and content tool inside of Canvas, because it checks every single link to make sure that it's accessible for our students. We want to make our links consistent, and we want to test the color contrast to make sure that the automatic color of the link is actually accessible within our course. Here's some examples of links. You'll see on the left, here's an email that has links with good descriptive text. And on the right, some examples of what not to do there, where you have just the URL and a link that says click here. When we talk about videos, we want to make sure that our videos are captioned, and that captioning should be synchronized and equivalent. That means that the captions actually match the words that are being spoken when they're being spoken. We want to provide audio descriptions for videos without speaking, and we want to provide transcripts if captions are not available, or even if they are. Sometimes it's helpful to have a caption. One of the most easiest tools that we have currently are Canvas Studio and Zoom captioning. So Zoom captioning is what we have going on right now. Actually, you can click live transcript and you should see it happening here on the bottom of the screen for us. You can also have that downloadable after the Zoom meeting so that you can have that transcript to provide to your students. Zoom captioning is where you've uploaded the video and it can have up to 85% accuracy. I'll let you know, it just sometimes doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. So you do need to look at the captions to make sure it gets the right words. For example, Canvas Studio captioning doesn't like the word Germana, and it doesn't like a really deep Southern accent. And so you kind of have to manage that as best you can. Document structure is another part of accessibility, and it goes the same thing with PDFs. We use headings to create organization and structure within a document so that when students who are using screen readers can skip between headings. So let's say that they've read this text before, or rather they've listened to it all together, and they just need to hear one little piece out of one particular section. If the entire page is marked as paragraph, that means the screen reader doesn't know how to skip through it. Instead, it's just going to read every single word. But if we use headers and we organize our pages and our documents, then we can make sure that our students are able to actually navigate through that document using assistive technology. What's nice is that this isn't just true for Canvas pages. This is also true for Microsoft Word documents and Google documents. They have built-in accessibility checkers that you can use to make sure that those document structures are correct. And finally, PDFs. If it's a PDF, it needs to be a searchable text, a searchable file, and not an image. And you can see the difference there. The one on the left is a searchable file, and it's opened up in Adobe Acrobat Pro, where we can search through the file or search through the text. It can be copied, it can be pasted, it can be navigated through. Whereas the text on the right is just part of an image. It's not a searchable PDF. And so it's not really accessible for our students. So that was a whole lot of stuff to check, a whole lot of stuff to keep in mind. And that's why we're happy that we've got a couple of tools that we can use to do that. So I'm going to pass it off to Paige so she can tell you about our two tools.
So I'm looking at the time and I see it's 7:49 and I have no intention in keeping anybody late. So we're going to probably move through this at quite a brisk little clip. So first of all, the Canvas Accessibility Checker. You're going to find that at the bottom of the rich content editor, and it's going to look like it's as you see on the screen, the little person with their arms open, so that you can click on that and then you can see what needs to be fixed. So what is it going to look for? It's going to look for links. It's going to look for headings. It's going to look for images to make sure they have alt text or file names. It's also going to look for lists, tables. Those are all of the things that is what it's going to check. And it's going to give you the option and how to check them. So if you now look in the next there you go. In that slide, it tells you that there are 11 things that are in the rich content editor that need to be checked as far as meeting an accessibility guideline. So if you click on that, you're going to see over on the far right that it's telling you that the file name should not be used as the alt text description. So you're going to want to put that alt text in there. And if it is just decorative, you need to make sure that you list it as decorative so that a screen reader would completely skip over it. The other thing is when you're doing that for images, you need to make sure that you are very descriptive of what the image is. So sorry, I have quite the cacophony going on in here. So to fix an issue, you're going to put in the alt text and then you click apply. And so you don't have to do anything else except click on the accessibility checker at the bottom, complete the pop out that comes from the right. And then once you do that, you know you do it because there are balloons that happen to let you know that you have fixed all of the accessibility errors that Canvas found for you. So on top of that, in our version of Canvas, we have access to a tool called UDoIt. What is UDoIt? It is a free online tool that was developed by the University of Central Florida, and it will check all of the following areas of Canvas: announcements, assignments, discussion files, pages, syllabus, and module URLs. What is it going to check for? It's going to check for the use of headings and page structure, alternative text for images, table headers, color contrast, and video captioning. But not only does it check for that, it also offers you a UFixit tool so you can fix those right from the same page. So you're going to find UDoIt in your course navigation. If you don't have it turned on, you can go to settings and you can pull it up into the course menu and turn it on. And then you're going to see all of the content that you can select, and then you're going to scan the course. Once you scan the course, it's going to give you a report, and you're going to have things that are red, that are errors, and then you're going to have things that are suggestions. And if you go over and you click on the plus, it's going to open that, and it's going to tell you exactly what is an error and what is a suggestion. Once you click on UFixit, it gives you the option. Oh, next slide. It gives you the option to preview or see the source and then put in the correction. So what you're looking at here is you're looking at the preview is nothing there, right? Because it is a link. So you're going to have to put in a very descriptive link so that your students will know exactly what it is they're clicking on. And then once you type that new text in, you click submit and it's automatically fixed. In the next one, you're going to see that alternative text should not be the name of the file. So you don't want to have your image named as the file. So you can again put in the new alt text and click submit. So what now? Now we're going to give you some things to think about. It's not homework, it's just some things to think about. And we've covered a lot in 54 minutes. So in the last 6 minutes, I want you to think about some things, and we're going to want and ask you to think small. So you're going to identify one module or one unit in your course. And then you're going to think about, do I have multiple ways for students to engage with the content? Do I have multiple means for interpretation and expression? So do I have multiple ways that students could complete a project or to have an assessment? And then you're going to think about adding a +1 opportunity. So that's one single module that you're going to think about. And then you're also going to think about, in that same module, does this module have evidence of being culturally responsive? And if it doesn't, then what is one thing that you could shift to make it more culturally responsive? Could something be gamified? Could you add some social component? Could you have it storyfied? And then you're going to add that to that same single module. And then the last thing is, when you are building your course at any point in time and at any point in the semester, you can use the link validator in Canvas and the UDoIt tool. But as you're building your content, you can always use the Canvas accessibility checker and make sure that you have identified and resolved all of the things that you have found in your course. So we shoved a lot. Again, that was a 3-hour session that we got into 56 minutes. So I'm looking to see right now if we have any questions. And yes, you will certainly get a copy of the slides, and they will be posted on the EdTech website. And to get to that website, it is it's edtech.vccs.edu/webinars. And if Forrest would put that in the chat, that would be awesome. And I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. And since it is Little Friday, I hope everybody has a great weekend.